In 2021, the Bureau of Labor Statistics released this census, the census of fatal occupational injuries.
Right.
It's the kind of sterile, government report that usually just gathers dust on a shelf somewhere. But buried in that data was a truly staggering reality. That year, 418 women died on the job in the United States.
Which is tragic. Absolutely tragic.
Tragic, absolutely. But in that exact same year, doing the exact same national labor, 4,764 men died on the job.
Yeah. That number it's heavy.
It's massive. Men accounted for over 91% of all workplace fatalities. We're talking about, the loggers, the roofers, the deep-sea fishermen, the iron workers.
The guys keeping the physical world running.
Exactly. Yet in the modern corporate boardroom or the university lecture hall, the men taking those lethal risks and literally keep the lights on are often the ones explicitly told they need to, check their privilege, decenter themselves, and apologize for toxic masculinity.
It is a profound and glaring statistical disparity. And it is exactly the kind of friction point that forces you to ask, how did our culture arrive at a place where the demographic doing the overwhelming majority of the dying to build civilization is, well, simultaneously framed as its greatest oppressor?
Which brings us directly to our mission today. We are embarking on a massive, highly detailed, deep dive into an explosive, uncompromising, and deeply polarizing new ebook. It's titled Feminist Hostages, Rescuing Men from the Woke Mind Virus, written by Conrad Riker.
Yeah, and this book is making serious waves.
Huge waves. And whether you, the listener, view this text as a righteous, long overdue awakening, or you view it as a controversial radical manifesto, it provides an absolutely fascinating, unfiltered look into the ideology of the modern men's rights movement and the manosphere.
It really maps it all out.
It does. More importantly, it offers a meticulous mapping out of the concept of institutional capture. This is the idea that our foundational systems, from family courts to universities to corporate HR departments, have been systematically overtaken by Marxist and feminist ideologies.
Now, before we unpack the specific mechanics and the historical data presented in this text, we need to make something explicitly clear about our approach today.
Right, the ground rules.
Exactly. We are not endorsing the political viewpoints of this text. Our mission here is to impartially report on the ideas, the data, the sociological frameworks, and the historical perspectives contained in the source material. We are treating this book as a highly influential cultural artifact.
That's perfectly stated.
Our goal is to dissect its anatomy so you, the listener, can genuinely understand the mechanical arguments being made, the specific data points being leveraged, and exactly why this book resonates so deeply with its target demographic. We aren't taking sides here.
Exactly. We are just looking at the blueprints of the argument. And if you want to truly understand the history of our institutions before they were allegedly captured, if you want to see the raw, unfiltered data for yourself, you really need to read the source material directly.
Oh, highly recommend getting the primary source.
For sure. So we highly encourage you to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook Feminist Hostages. You should also follow the author, at Conrad Riker, on Substack for his ongoing, unfiltered analysis of these cultural shifts.
Yeah, he posts a lot of follow-up essays there.
He does. And of course, please like and subscribe to our show right now so we can keep bringing you these incredibly deep investigative dives. We rely on you guys.
Definitely. So, looking at the book, Riker's entire manifesto is built on a very specific architecture. He doesn't just, start throwing punches at random institutions.
No, it's very systematic.
Right. He begins with a foundational psychological premise. He outlines a specific trap he believes every modern man is currently caught in. He then traces how this psychological trap was weaponized to capture the family courts, how it infected academia, and how it ultimately killed meritocracy in the corporate workplace.
And then he gives solutions, right?
Yes. Finally, he lays out his tactical, real-world solutions for how men can reclaim their autonomy by systematically exiting these captured frameworks.
So let's start right there at the foundation. To understand the sheer velocity of the author's anger throughout this book, and he is very angry, you really have to understand this psychological trap he believes we are all living inside. He calls it the misandrist double bind.
The double bind, yeah.
And if you are listening to this and wondering what a double bind actually is mechanically, let's break it down, because it's a real psychological term.
It is. The double bind is actually a concept pulled from traditional psychology and communication theory. It was originally formulated by Gregory Bateson in the 1950s.
Okay.
A double bind is a communicative dilemma where an individual receives two or more conflicting messages, with one message completely negating the other. The crucial part of a double bind, and this is what makes it so damaging, is that the person cannot successfully respond to either message without failing the other.
Right. It's a lose-lose scenario.
Exactly. And they are not allowed to point out the contradiction or leave the situation. It creates a state of total psychological paralysis. Riker takes this clinical concept and applies it directly to the modern male experience.
Right. And he frames it like this. On one hand, in times of crisis, society still absolutely demands traditional male roles.
Oh, 100%.
If a war breaks out, if a pipe bursts flooding a home, if someone breaks into the house at 3 a.m., or, if the economy crashes and a family needs a provider, society instantly turns to men and demands they step up, protect, and provide.
They want the traditional patriarch back the second things get scary.
Yeah. They're expected to be stoic, competent, and aggressive in solving the problem.
But, and this is where the jaws of the trap snap shut, when men display the exact traits necessary to fulfill those protective roles, traits like assertiveness, competitiveness, emotional stoicism, and dominance, the broader culture simultaneously demonizes those exact same traits as toxic masculinity.
It's maddening. Riker is essentially saying that the culture demands men act like traditional protectors when the ship is sinking, but treats them like a dangerous threat when the waters are calm.
That's a great way to put it.
It's like having a specialized, heavily armed rescue team on a cruise ship, but locking them in the brig because the passengers find their gear intimidating, and then only screaming for them to break down the door and save everyone when the hull breaches.
That is a highly accurate analogy for his premise. If a man is soft, compliant, and highly emotional, he is mocked as weak and unappealing often by the very progressive voices demanding that he be vulnerable in the first place.
Yeah, the whole "we want you to cry" thing, but then they lose respect when he does.
Exactly. But if he is dominant, assertive, and takes charge, he is branded an oppressive tyrant who is traumatizing the people around him. Now, Riker is adamant that this is not an accidental cultural drift. He doesn't view this as society just clumsily figuring out gender roles.
He thinks it's on purpose.
Yes. He frames this double bind as a deliberate, calculated Marxist strategy.
Which implies intent. So, why would someone intentionally design a trap like that?
According to the text, the goal was never equality. The goal of this ideological movement is forced male submission.
Wow. Submission.
By placing men in a psychological prison where every single action they take is wrong, you erode their confidence. You neutralize their innate biological drive to lead and build. A population of men caught in a double bind is paralyzed by self-doubt, making them completely compliant and removing them as a threat to progressive institutional control.
And he doesn't just leave this as some abstract sociological theory. He grounds it in very recent history. He points to specific institutions that were historically designed to build male competency, and he tracks their systemic dismantling.
The Boy Scouts.
Yes. The prime example he uses, and it's a timeline that really makes you stop and stare when you see it laid out chronologically, is the Boy Scouts of America.
Riker uses the Boy Scouts as his masterclass case study in what he terms cultural surrender and a hostile takeover. He argues that to destroy male authority, you first have to destroy the institutions that train boys how to navigate male hierarchies, build physical competence, and forge brotherhood away from the influence of women.
Right. So let's look at the mechanics of this timeline, as Riker presents it. The organization was founded way back in 1910. The original intent was to forge boys into self-reliant men through rugged outdoor survival, merit-based advancement, and strict moral codes. For over a century, it was the premier male competency building institution in the country.
It was institutionalized masculinity.
Exactly. Then, the cultural pressure campaigns began. In 2013, under massive corporate and media pressure, the organization votes to allow openly gay scouts. Then, in 2015, they dropped the ban on gay scout leaders.
And from Riker's perspective, this is where the camel's nose is under the tent. He argues that the progressive left didn't actually care about camping or not tying.
Right.
They cared about breaking the exclusionary boundary of a male space. Once that boundary was proven permeable to ideological pressure, the demands rapidly escalated.
Exactly. It's a slippery slope argument that he validates with the timeline.
Yeah.
Because just 3 years later, in 2018, the organization caves completely and officially admits girls into the core Cub Scout and Boy Scout programs.
They break the final gender barrier.
Yeah. Now, what's fascinating is the fallout. By 2020, just 2 years after admitting girls and fundamentally altering their core identity, the national organization files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy.
2 years. That's incredibly fast.
And finally, in 2024, they announce a complete rebrand, dropping the word boy entirely to become the sterile, gender-neutral, scouting America.
Riker views this entire sequence of events strictly through the lens of a gynocentric attack strategy. He argues that progressive enablers and feminists were infuriated that boys had an exclusive merit-based system designed to build structural hierarchy and brotherhood.
So they infiltrated it.
According to the text, feminist organizations and progressive activists demanded entry not because they genuinely wanted to participate in rugged, uncomfortable outdoor struggles, but specifically to strip the organization of its masculine identity. They wanted to force it to celebrate what Riker calls egalitarian mediocrity.
And he makes a really provocative point about the hypocrisy of this entire cultural shift. He claims that the immense hypocrisy of this progressive left-wing apparatus relies entirely on the unacknowledged sacrifice of men.
He does. He points out that the ideological framework that pushes this Marxist drivel, his words, not mine attempts to pathologize male drive as a literal disease.
Right.
Yet Riker emphasizes that the modern independence, the safety, and the incredibly comfortable existence of these exact same progressive activists are entirely subsidized by male labor. He argues that it is men who maintain the electrical grid in freezing rain, men who pave the highways, men who dive into the sewers, and men who build the skyscrapers.
Right. They do the grueling physical, structural work to keep society functioning, which creates the safe, climate-controlled, comfortable environment that allows a gender studies professor the luxury of sitting in a coffee shop and complaining about toxic masculinity in the first place.
Precisely. Without the brutal physical sacrifice of men maintaining the base layer of reality, the entire superstructure of progressive ideology collapses instantly.
Okay, so if society is culturally locking men in this psychological brig, how does this abstract trap manifest legally?
That's where things get really bleak.
Yeah, like if a man refuses to submit to the double bind, how does the system actually punish him? How does it hit his wallet and his freedom? This is where Riker points a massive, very angry finger directly at the family court system. He frames it as the primary legal weapon used by the state to systematically dismantle the patriarchal family.
The transition from the cultural to the legal is where Riker's analysis becomes highly mechanical. He describes the modern American family court not as an impartial arbiter of justice or child welfare, but literally as a state-mandated ATM system.
An ATM. Wow.
He views the entire apparatus as a Marxist wealth redistribution revolution disguised as family law. Riker argues that the progressive left effectively weaponized the concept of toxic masculinity within the judiciary to ensure that men almost automatically lose in court.
And he claims the foundational assumption of these courts is entirely misandrous. According to the book, the operating system of a family court assumes that mothers are inherently superior, nurturing parents, and that fathers are utterly expendable. The father is reduced to a weekend visitor and a walking, heavily regulated wallet.
And he brings incredibly specific receipts to back up this claim. He doesn't just say they're biased, he dives into the legislative mechanics of this financial extraction. The most prominent example he highlights is the Bradley Amendment of 1986.
Yes, the Bradley Amendment. If you are a listener who hasn't encountered family law, this part is genuinely terrifying. Let's unpack the mechanics of this. Enacted in 1986, this is a federal law that strictly prohibits the retroactive modification of child support arrearages.
Right, and to understand why Riker is so furious about this, you really have to understand how it works in practice. What the Bradley Amendment means legally is that if a man falls behind on his child support payments, that debt becomes immortal.
Immortal debt.
A judge is federally prohibited from forgiving or reducing that past due amount, no matter the reason it accrued. So, if a man loses his job in a recession, suffers a catastrophic physical injury at work, or literally falls into a medical coma for 6 months, his child support debt continues to compound every single month at the original rate, often with massive interest attached.
So he wakes up from a coma, and he owes $50,000, and the judge legally cannot forgive a dime of it.
The judge's hands are tied by federal law.
Riker literally calls it a modern debtor's prison for men. Because if you can't pay this insurmountable debt, they suspend your driver's license, making it impossible to work, and then they throw you in a physical jail cell for contempt of court.
And the most shocking dystopian application of this amendment that Riker highlights involves DNA testing. Under the rigid framework of the Bradley Amendment, men are routinely forced by family courts to continue paying child support for years, sometimes decades, even when subsequent rigorous genetic DNA testing definitively proves they are not the biological father of the child.
Wait, let me make sure I'm getting this right. A man proves with a 99.9% scientific certainty that the child is not his. Like perhaps because his wife had an affair and the court still forces him to pay. How does that even work legally?
The legal mechanism is called paternity by estoppel, or default judgments. If a man was married to the mother at the time of birth, or if he signed a birth certificate before finding out the truth, the state designates him as the legal father,
Even if he was lied to.
even if it's based on deception. When he later discovers the biological truth and tries to stop paying, the court often rules that because he acted as the father, and because severing the financial tie would harm the child's standard of living, he must continue paying. The court essentially ignores objective biological reality because the man has already been designated as the financial instrument of the state.
That is insane. It completely severs the concept of responsibility from reality. But why would the system be so relentless? I mean, why wouldn't a judge look at that and say, obviously, this man shouldn't pay for another man's child? Riker claims it's because the system itself is financially incentivized to maximize extraction.
Yes. To enforce this wealth extraction, Riker details Title 4D of the Social Security Act. This is a critical piece of the puzzle. This is the financial engine that powers the entire family court system. Under Title 4BD, the federal government actually pays state governments financial incentives based directly on the amount of child support the state collects.
Okay, so break that down. If a state aggressively extracts more money from fathers, the federal government cuts the state a larger check.
Exactly. The federal government matches funds and provides performance bonuses based on collection rates. Riker argues this creates a massive, perverse incentive structure. It gives state governments, and by extension the family courts operating within them, a direct, highly lucrative financial motive to ruthlessly maximize child support awards.
So the courts are profiting.
He claims it turns supposedly impartial family court judges into commission bill collectors working for the federal government. The higher the award, the more federal money flows into the state's coffers to fund the judicial bureaucracy.
And the fallout from this industrial-scale father removal is devastating. He points to U.S. Census Bureau and Department of Justice data linking fatherless homes to horrific societal outcomes. According to the data he cites, boys from fatherless homes account for over 70% of juveniles in state-operated institutions, like youth prisons and reform schools. They account for the vast majority of high school dropouts and youth suicides.
Riker's conclusion is that the state actively engineers fatherless homes under the fraudulent guise of protecting women and children. It destroys the father's authority, evicts him from his own home, extracts his wealth, and leaves his young boys at the mercy of vindictive single mothers and what Riker views as a heavily misandrous public school system.
So, hearing all of this, what is a man supposed to do? If the legal system is a wood chipper designed to extract his wealth, how should a man operate? Riker's advice here is brutally, almost chillingly pragmatic.
He tells his readers that they can no longer view marriage as a romantic partnership. They must treat the modern American marriage contract as a high-risk, hostile merger.
A hostile merger.
Yes. He demands that any man considering marriage must utilize ironclad prenuptial agreements with stringent, highly specific clauses protecting his premarital assets, capping alimony, and severely punishing false allegations of abuse, which he claims are routinely used as a tactical nuke in divorce proceedings to gain custody.
He views a prenup not as planning for failure, but as absolute legal and financial self-defense in an era where the state has essentially declared open war on fatherhood. But that raises a massive question. If the legal system is engineered from the top down to extract wealth and separate fathers from children, how did this ideology leak into the educational system that is supposed to be preparing these very same kids for the real world? Who is teaching young men that this system is normal and just?
Riker points a massive spotlight directly at academia. He argues that the destruction of the family and the courts is fundamentally supported and justified by the ideological re-education occurring every day in public schools and universities. Riker views the modern university system as entirely captured. He says it has been overrun by pseudoscience and a preponderance of feelings, abandoning empirical truth in favor of acting as Marxist indoctrination camps.
And just like with the family courts, he traces this academic capture back to a very specific, seemingly innocuous piece of legislation, Title IX.
Title IX is a fascinating case study in institutional mutation. Enacted in 1972, the original statute is remarkably brief. It's just 37 words long.
Wow, 37 words.
Yep. Originally, it was a straightforward, well-intentioned civil rights law meant to guarantee equal access to educational programs and, most famously, collegiate sports, regardless of sex.
Right, ensuring women's track teams got funding alongside the men's football teams. But Riker argues those 37 words mutated over decades into a sprawling, multi-billion-dollar, deeply misandrous campus bureaucracy. And he pinpoints the exact date this mutation became legally lethal for male students. April 4th, 2011.
April 4th, 2011 is the day the Obama administration's Office for Civil Rights issued the now infamous Dear Colleague letter. Riker explains that this federal directive forced every university in the country receiving federal funds to drastically alter how they handled accusations of sexual misconduct. Prior to this, universities generally used a clear and convincing evidence standard, meaning you needed substantial proof to ruin a student's life and expel them.
But the Dear Colleague letter mandated that universities lower that burden of proof to a preponderance of the evidence standard. For listeners who aren't lawyers, preponderance of the evidence mathematically translates to a 50.01% threshold.
It's basically a tiebreaker.
Exactly. It essentially means more likely than not. It is a statistical coin flip.
Right. Riker argues this unconstitutional federal directive effectively stripped male college students of their fundamental right to due process. It established a terrifying precedent of guilty until proven innocent. He argues it transformed college campuses into ideological kangaroo courts, where objective reality, police evidence, and cross-examination were entirely replaced by subjective emotional interpretation and victim-centered belief systems.
He paints a picture where a progressive female student could artificially manufacture a hostile environment out of thin air simply by claiming she felt offended or unsafe by a man's mere presence, his tone of voice, or, clumsy romantic advance. And because the standard was 50.01%, the man will be expelled just to protect the university from federal defunding.
And this institutional power grab within the campus administration is backed up by what Riker sees as total academic fraud within the academic departments themselves. He brings up a legendary event known as the Sokol Squared hoax to prove his point about the death of peer review.
Oh, the Sokol Squared hoax. This happened between 2017 and 2018, and it is honestly one of the most hilarious and terrifying indictments of modern academia I have ever read.
It really is wild.
3 independent researchers, Peter Baroshin, James Lindsay, and Helen Pluckrose, decided to test the scientific rigor of gender studies and cultural studies journals. They literally wrote 20 completely fake, aggressively absurd, mathematically impossible academic papers.
And they submitted them to leading, highly respected, peer-reviewed humanities journals. Riker emphasizes this to show that the gatekeepers of knowledge are completely compromised.
The details of the fake papers are incredible. They wrote one paper arguing that dog parts are petri dishes of canine rape culture and systemic oppression, proposing that we should measure dog humping incidents to understand human patriarchy.
And that one got accepted, right?
Not just accepted. That paper actually won an award for excellence in feminist geography.
It is unbelievable.
It gets worse. They wrote another paper analyzing bodybuilding from a fat-inclusive perspective. They even took a chapter of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, replaced the word Jews with men and white privilege, and a feminist journal accepted it for publication.
They managed to get 7 of these deliberately nonsensical papers published before they were caught by a journalist. Riker uses this to prove definitively that the peer review process in these humanities departments isn't testing for scientific rigor, methodology, or truth. It's purely testing for ideological compliance. If a paper flatters the progressive narrative that men are evil and society is oppressive, it gets published no matter how insane the methodology.
But where did this specific anti-science ideology come from? How did it infect the universities in the first place? Riker traces the philosophical roots back to the mid-20th century, specifically pointing to the Frankfurt School and Marxist theorists like Wilhelm Reich.
Yes, Riker connects the dots directly from early Marxist theory to modern gender studies. He argues that theorists like Wilhelm Reich had an explicit stated goal to sexualize youth and actively dismantle the traditional nuclear family. The logic behind this is purely political. If you destroy the biological, patriarchal bedrock of the family, you destroy a person's primary loyalty.
The idea being that a strong family is independent of the government.
Exactly. You want to fundamentally transform society into a hive of obedient, state-dependent citizens who are stripped of any local or patriarchal loyalty. Riker's thesis is that a man who is loyal to his wife, his children, and his extended family is a massive threat to a totalitarian state because he will fight for them over the state. But a man stripped of his family, isolated, and addicted to state-sanctioned hedonism will submit entirely to the authority of the government.
And he brings this right up to the present day by targeting the godmother of modern gender theory, Judith Butler, and her highly influential 1990 book, Gender Trouble. Butler is the academic who essentially mainstreamed the idea that gender is merely a social construct and a performance, rather than a biological reality.
She's incredibly influential.
Yeah, she basically bypassed empirical biological debate by simply declaring that biological reality itself is a construct of the white patriarchy.
Riker counters Butler's dense academic jargon with a brutally simple, highly mechanical biological syllogism. He states, if XX and XY chromosomes dictate biological sex at a cellular level, and biological sex is the immutable foundation of mammalian reproduction, then subjective human feelings or social performances cannot override material reality. You cannot identify your way out of your chromosomal structure.
And yet, Riker notes the woke left demands absolute participation in this delusion. He points to the phenomenon of forced pronoun enforcement in schools and workplaces. He doesn't view this as mere politeness. He calls it a linguistic hostage situation.
He views mandated pronouns as compelled speech. According to Riker, the purpose of forcing someone to use zezer, or they-them, for a single person isn't about respect. It's a psychological compliance test designed to degrade rational discourse. It forces citizens to kowtow to a religion of absolute conformity.
It's about power.
His logic is terrifyingly simple. If the system can force you to verbally state that a biological man is a woman, they have broken your connection to objective reality. They have broken your will. And once they can make you deny what your own eyes see, they can make you agree to absolutely anything.
Now, if you are listening to this and thinking, okay, maybe the humanities departments at elite colleges are captured by this stuff, but surely the real world is immune. What happens when this ideology hits the hard metrics of the corporate world or the fiercely competitive tech sector? You'd think the free market would violently reject an ideology that prioritizes feelings over competence and efficiency.
You would think so, yes.
But Riker argues that the ideological infection bled directly out of the universities and straight into corporate human resources departments, resulting in what he calls the death of meritocracy.
Riker claims that in the modern corporate landscape, men no longer climb the ladder through actual merit, raw grit, long hours, or technological innovation. Instead, they climb it by paying what he terms a compliance dividend.
A compliance dividend. What does that actually look like in a daily office environment?
It is the daily tax of self-degradation that competent men are forced to pay to keep their jobs. It's putting your pronouns in your email signature even when you find it absurd. It's the forced, polite smiles at mandatory diversity, equity, and inclusion seminars where you're told your race and sex make you inherently oppressive.
Right, it's walking on eggshells.
It is the total, crushing silence competent men maintain in the face of absolute corporate lunacy just to avoid being targeted by HR.
And he argues that the foundational civil rights legislation of the country has been weaponized to enforce this. He says the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 has been completely inverted. Instead of its original intent, which was to prevent discrimination based on race or sex, the modern diversity industry uses inclusion as a Trojan horse to actively and aggressively discriminate against competent, heterosexual, white, and Asian men.
To illustrate how violently the corporate system will react to empirical truth, Riker uses the prime example of James Damore's firing from Google in 2018.
Yes, the Google memo. This was a massive cultural flashpoint. James Damore was a senior software engineer at Google. He attended a diversity seminar and felt the science being presented was inaccurate, so he wrote an internal memo. Now, the media narrative was that he wrote a manifesto saying women are biologically incapable of coding.
Which is completely false.
Right. Riker argues that is a complete fabrication of what Damore actually wrote.
It is. If you read the actual memo, Damore merely cited mainstream peer-reviewed scientific data regarding biological differences in personality trait distributions between men and women. He suggested that the gender gap in tech might be influenced more by biological differences in interests. Men naturally gravitating toward systemizing in things, women naturally gravitating toward empathizing in people, rather than being solely the result of systemic patriarchal oppression at Google.
He was trying to explain the disparity using evolutionary psychology, and the response from Google wasn't to debate his data, it was to instantly terminate him. Riker views his firing as the ultimate proof that the social justice cult within HR will violently attack free speech and empirical truth to protect its fragile dogma.
Riker contrasts that sterile, terrifying, eggshell-walking corporate environment with an example he holds up as the gold standard of male innovation and structural competence: the PayPal Mafia.
The PayPal Mafia. We were talking about guys like Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, Max Levchin, David Sachs. Before diversity mandates, ESG scores, and HR witch hunts took over Silicon Valley, PayPal operated in the late 90s and early 2000s as an unapologetic, ruthlessly competitive boys' club.
Riker points out that they fought constantly. They challenged each other directly, loudly, and aggressively. They ignored all modern corporate sensitivities. They didn't care about your feelings. They cared if your code worked.
And it paid off.
Exactly. And because they operated as an uncompromising brotherhood of pure competence, unburdened by diversity quotas, they built a massive financial empire and spawned the founders of Tesla, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Palantir.
And this brings us back to that staggering statistic we opened the show with. Riker uses the reality of male physical sacrifice to completely dismantle the progressive concept of the gender wage gap. He points back to the Bureau of Labor Statistics census of fatal occupational injuries from 2021. 4,764 men dying on the job compared to 418 women.
Riker argues this incredibly grim data proves that men earn more money over their lifetimes, not because of a secret, smoky room patriarchal conspiracy to oppress women, but because men overwhelmingly take on the brutal, agonizing, lethal jobs that literally keep civilization functioning. Men do the deep-sea oil drilling, the high-voltage line repair in blizzards, the underground coal mining.
He argues that the extra money in a man's paycheck isn't a privilege. It is a hazard pay down payment on his own physical destruction. Men trade their cartilage, their spines, their lungs, and frequently their lives for a higher hourly wage to provide for their families.
And this leads to one of Riker's most controversial claims regarding the corporate world. He claims that feminism pulled off the greatest con job in human history regarding this labor dynamic.
Right. He says feminism tricked women into believing that traditional domestic power running a household, raising children, being the center of a family, was a prison. They convinced women to trade the profound legacy of the home for the sterile, fluorescent-lit confines of a corporate cubicle, answering to a boss who doesn't care about them.
From an economic standpoint, Riker argues this simply doubled the labor pool overnight, which predictably devalued wages for everyone. It chained women to the exact same miserable corporate grinder that men have historically endured out of necessity.
So everyone loses.
But worst of all, he argues, it left modern women deeply lonely. Because, according to evolutionary psychology, women fundamentally refuse to date or marry men who earn less than them or hold lower status. So, by artificially elevating women in the corporate hierarchy while artificially suppressing men, feminism engineered a dating apocalypse where successful women cannot find men they respect.
So if the modern HR department acts like a Soviet commissar, enforcing ideology over output and aggressively hunting down non-compliance, how does Riker advise men to survive this environment? I mean, you can't just quit your job if you have a mortgage.
He introduces what he calls the gray man strategy for corporate survival. In tactical terms, a gray man is someone who blends in completely, offering no defining characteristics, drawing zero attention to themselves. Riker advises men to give the corporate HR department absolutely zero emotional engagement.
Wait, so his advice is just to lie. Sit in a cubicle, pretend to be a compliant drone, and swallow your pride. Doesn't that contradict his entire point about maintaining masculine authenticity, truth, and dominance?
It sounds contradictory at first, but Riker frames it as tactical espionage rather than submission. He says you nod, you smile politely at the diversity seminars, you keep your head down, and you reveal absolutely nothing about your true political or social beliefs to your coworkers. You become a ghost. But while you are doing this, you act as a sleeper agent.
Ah, okay. So you use the corporation against itself.
Exactly. You use the corporation's high-speed internet, their expensive hardware, and their paid time to secretly build a personal entrepreneurial fortress on the side. You extract their resources to build your escape pod. And crucially, you use this time to build shadow alliances.
He talks about building untraceable professional networks on heavily encrypted messaging apps like Signal or Telegram. The idea is that you identify other competent, like-minded men within the company. You refer high-paying freelance contracts strictly to your trusted brotherhood. You bypass the woke corporate structure entirely, creating a parallel economy hidden right under the nose of the HR department.
Now, if we move from the physical workplace to the broader cultural and biological environment, Riker argues that this multi-front war on men isn't just institutional. It is actively enforced digitally, and it is actively enforced biologically.
It's a full-spectrum attack.
He posits that the left weaponizes victimhood and uses digital censorship to suppress male excellence, while simultaneously waging a literal, measurable chemical war on male testosterone.
Let's unpack the digital censorship side first. To illustrate the cultural rot, Riker contrasts two very different types of American behavior. First, he looks at the sheer biological resilience of Audie Murphy.
A true hero.
For those who don't know, Audie Murphy was the most decorated American combat soldier of World War II. At 19 years old, he jumped onto a burning tank destroyer and held off an entire company of German soldiers alone for an hour using a .50 caliber machine gun while wounded. He represents the pinnacle of traditional male resilience.
And then Riker compares him to the Yale protests.
Yes, Roker contrasts that historical reality with the progressive students during the infamous 2015 Yale Halloween costume protests.
The Yale protests are a critical, highly symbolic case study for Riker. During that event, students literally surrounded a brilliant faculty member, Professor Nicholas Christakis, in a courtyard. They wept, they screamed obscenities in his face, and they demanded he be fired simply because his wife had written an email.
An email about Halloween costumes.
Right. Suggesting that college students should be free to choose their own Halloween costumes, and that free speech should outweigh manufactured trauma regarding cultural appropriation.
It is deeply uncomfortable video to watch. These are elite Ivy League students screaming like toddlers because someone suggested they don't need the administration to police their Halloween costumes. Riker argues this pathetic display proves that coddling breeds fascistic intolerance. We traded the rugged, stoic resilience of the greatest generation for overgrown toddlers who have learned to weaponize their own helplessness to gain institutional power.
And Riker points out that this tactic isn't accidental. He connects the dots straight back to the Marxist philosopher Herbert Marcuse and his highly influential 1965 essay titled Repressive Tolerance.
How does that mechanism work?
Marcuse explicitly argued that for a society to achieve true liberation, it must practice intolerance against right-wing, traditional, or conservative speech, while practicing absolute tolerance for left-wing subversion. Leftists have adopted this philosophy entirely. They have weaponized the concept of harm, painting themselves as victims of literal physical violence whenever they are simply exposed to factual data or traditional ideas they dislike.
Words are violence, basically.
Exactly. This allows them to justify massive state and corporate censorship under the unassailable guise of safety.
And we saw the digital manifestation of this exact philosophy exposed in late 2022 with the release of the Twitter files by journalists Matt Taibbi and Bari Weiss. The internal documents revealed how former tech executives like Vijaya Gadde and Yoel Roth secretly shadow banned, throttled, and outright censored dissenting male voices, such as Dr. Jordan Peterson or anyone questioning COVID mandates or gender ideology.
Riker argues these tech oligarchs hide cowardly behind the legislative shield of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. That law grants them broad legal immunity from being sued for what users post, treating them like a neutral public square. But Riker argues the Twitter files prove they were acting as highly partisan publishers, actively silencing male strength and traditional viewpoints while aggressively algorithmically rewarding manufactured progressive frailty.
But Riker argues the attack isn't just algorithmic, it's chemical. He dives deep into the biological attrition of the male body, and the data he brings up here is genuinely alarming.
It really is.
He cites a landmark 2007 study by Travison and his colleagues, published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism. This incredibly rigorous research documented a massive global decline in male testosterone levels over the preceding 5 decades.
And to be clear, the study proved this drop was completely independent of normal aging, obesity, or lifestyle changes. A 30-year-old man today has significantly lower testosterone than a 30-year-old man did in 1980. Riker attributes this catastrophic decline to the left-wing nanny state weaponizing environmental toxins.
Wait, he thinks the government is deliberately poisoning the water to make men docile. That sounds like a massive conspiracy theory.
Well, he doesn't necessarily argue that a cabal of cartoon villains is dumping poison in the reservoirs. He argues it is a deliberate, negligent tolerance of highly profitable toxins by captured regulatory agencies. He points specifically to endocrine-disrupting chemicals like bisphenol A, or BPA, phthalates in plastics, and synthetic hormones in the water supply. He calls them synthetic estrogens deliberately allowed by the FDA and EPA to slowly chemically castrate the populace, making them weaker, fatter, and more compliant.
And to back this up, he highlights the terrifying 2002 research by UC Berkeley endocrinologist Tyrone Hayes. Hayes proved that atrazine, which is one of the most widely used agricultural herbicides in the United States, literally chemically castrates male frogs.
It turns them female.
Yeah. When exposed to even minute, legally permissible amounts of atrazine in the water, male frogs stopped producing testosterone and literally began growing ovaries.
It is peer-reviewed science published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And yet, Riker points out, the EPA continues to allow millions of pounds of atrazine to be sprayed on American crops every year. Riker sees a direct, terrifying biological parallel between the chemical feminization of amphibians and the plummeting testosterone and sperm counts of human males.
And he claims the medical establishment is entirely complicit in this pacification of boys. He looks at CDC data showing the absolute tripling of ADHD diagnoses in young boys between 1997 and 2006.
They're drugging boys for being boys.
Riker argues exactly that the female-dominated public school system looks at normal male kinetic energy, physical boisterousness, and competitive drive, diagnoses it as a medical defect, and immediately initiates the mass prescription of heavy behavioral medications like Ritalin and Adderall. They chemically suppress a boy's natural aggression so he will sit quietly at a desk for 8 hours.
This physical and digital pacification feeds into a fascinating sociological framework that Riker calls the distance from consequence theory.
I found this theory incredibly insightful. Explain how it works.
The theory explains why elite progressives relentlessly advocate for the elimination of traditional male protection policies, like defunding the police, eliminating bail, or emptying prisons. Riker argues they push these destructive policies because their immense wealth, their remote work tech jobs, and their gated, privately armed communities completely insulate them from the catastrophic results of their own ideological experiments.
He calls it the Portland paradigm. Weak, progressive politicians abandon masculine, structural protection and police enforcement in cities like Portland, Oregon, to appease the woke mob. And because they removed the threat of male physical force, the city immediately fell to devastating business closures, unchecked open-air drug markets, violent crime spikes, and a complete breakdown of societal order.
But the politicians were fine.
Right. The elites who voted for it just moved to the suburbs, leaving the working class to suffer the consequences of their virtue signaling.
This naturally leads to Riker proactively attacking the foundational premise of the progressive left. If traditional male hierarchy and patriarchy are so intensely demonized, what is the left's proposed alternative? Do they really believe a society entirely led by female energy would be a utopia?
Riker calls this the delusion of matriarchy, and he spends an entire section of the book aggressively dismantling the pseudo-historical assertion that a world ruled exclusively by women would be a peaceful, collaborative paradise, completely free of war and conflict.
To dismantle this myth, he relies heavily on evolutionary psychology, specifically pointing to the foundational 1995 research of Dr. Ann Campbell regarding female indirect aggression. Campbell's research proved that women avoid physical confrontation not out of some innate magical moral superiority to men, but strictly to preserve their biological reproductive fitness.
Right. Evolutionarily speaking, if a man dies in a fist fight, he just loses the chance to reproduce again. But if a mother dies in a physical fight, her infant starves. So women evolved to avoid physical combat. But they didn't evolve to be peaceful, they just changed the weapon.
Exactly. Instead of using fists or swords, women evolved to weaponize social networks. They used gossip, reputational destruction, whispering campaigns, ostracism, and bureaucratic manipulation to utterly destroy their rivals.
Riker hilariously calls this mean girl geopolitics. And he brings up historical heavyweights to prove his point that women are just as violently capable as men when given state power. He points to Margaret Thatcher eagerly launching the Falklands War. He points to Catherine the Great and Queen Victoria enthusiastically engaging in brutal imperialism, violently suppressing rebellions, and conquering territory.
History doesn't lie.
Exactly. A woman on the throne, Riker argues, brings out the exact same ruthless, psychopathic aggression as a conquering king. It is just masked behind layers of psychological manipulation rather than transparent physical battle on the front lines.
He then connects this evolutionary psychology directly to the modern domestic sphere, citing David Buss's 1994 landmark text, The Evolution of Desire. This is a crucial piece of Riker's puzzle. Buss's research demonstrates the reality of female hypergamy.
So hypergamy, for those who might not know the term, is the biological instinct, primarily in women, to marry up or seek a partner with equal or significantly greater resources, status, and physical protective capability than themselves.
Correct. Women are fundamentally biologically hardwired to be sexually and romantically repulsed by weak, submissive men who fail to demonstrate protective competence and leadership. So, Riker argues, when the progressive cultural matrix demands that a modern husband submit entirely to his wife's rule, apologize for his masculinity, and aggressively check his privilege, a biological paradox occurs.
Because he's doing what she asks, but
the wife's innate ancient hypergamy causes her to subconsciously lose all physical and emotional respect for him. This results in a chaotic, sexless, deeply resentful domestic nightmare that usually ends in a wife-initiated divorce.
You cannot socially engineer your way out of millions of years of evolution. But Riker argues that this progressive delusion of replacing biology with feelings reaches its absolute darkest, most destructive apex in modern medical gender ideology. He doesn't just view this as a weird cultural trend. He views it as a full-scale assault on human sanity, an ideological terrorism specifically targeting vulnerable children.
To support his condemnation, Riker relies heavily on the Cass Review. This is the massive independent inquiry into the UK's National Health Service, specifically investigating the Tavistock Clinic, which was published in 2024. Dr. Hilary Cass, a former president of the Royal College of Pediatrics, systematically dismantled what is known as the affirmative care model.
And the affirmative care model is the practice where if a troubled 12-year-old girl walks into a clinic and says she feels like a boy, the doctors are required to immediately affirm that belief, socially transition her, and rapidly put her on a pathway to experimental puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones without exploring underlying mental health issues like autism or trauma.
Yes, and Dr. Cass's massive review proved that the entire foundation of this youth gender transition model is built on remarkably weak, shoddy, and ideologically compromised evidence. She found that puberty blockers are not merely a harmless pause button, but actively alter brain and bone development.
Which is horrifying.
Riker argues that the American medical establishment organizations like the AAP and the AMA have completely abandoned the Hippocratic oath of do no harm to appease the woke gods of diversity and to cash in on the massive, lifelong profits generated by medicalizing healthy children.
He also cites Dr. Lisa Lippman's groundbreaking 2018 Brown University study on rapid onset gender dysphoria, or ROGD. Dr. Lippman found that the massive spike in teenage girls suddenly identifying as transgender wasn't an innate biological awakening. She framed it as a virulent social contagion, essentially a psychological peer contagion spread rapidly through social media algorithms, TikTok influencers, and peer pressure among isolated, anxious teenage girls.
It is the modern equivalent of an anorexia cluster.
Exactly. Riker's proposed solution to this medical malpractice is uncompromising and highly aggressive. He advocates that conservative state attorneys general use the I-Key Act, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, which was designed to take down the mafia to strategically obliterate gender clinics.
RIK charges, that's intense.
He argues that because these clinics operate across state lines, are heavily funded by big pharmaceutical companies, and push coordinated, highly profitable, irreversible surgeries on minors based on fraudulent science, they perfectly meet the legal criteria for federal racketeering charges. He wants them prosecuted as organized crime syndicates.
So to summarize his massive diagnostic framework, he is arguing that replacing patriarchy with matriarchy doesn't end war. It just moves the battlefield from the physical trenches to the realm of psychological manipulation, while simultaneously allowing organized, profit-driven predators to butcher the bodies of children under the unassailable guise of inclusivity and safety.
That is the complete architecture of his grievance. He believes the courts, the schools, the corporations, and the medical establishments are terminally captured by a misandrist mind virus.
Which brings us to the ultimate question of the deep dive.
Right.
Having diagnosed this entire sprawling system as terminally captured and actively hostile to men, what is Riker's actionable advice? What is the payload of this manifesto for the men reading it? How do they actually survive?
Riker's solution is not to protest. He calls for men to reclaim what he terms patriarchal authority and to adopt a lifestyle philosophy he titles the Iron Standard.
The Iron Standard.
Yes. The fundamental operational concept here borrows heavily from tech investor Balaji Srinivasan's 2013 presentation on the concept of exit over voice.
Let's define that. Voice means trying to fix a broken, corrupt system from the inside. It means voting in rigged elections, protesting with signs, writing angry letters to your HR department, or wasting hours debating feminists on internet forums. Riker says engaging in voice is a total, pathetic waste of male oxygen because the system is designed to absorb your complaints and ignore them.
Right, feeds the machine.
Exit, however, is the ultimate flex of male power. Exit means you stop complaining. You withdraw your consent. You build a completely insulated parallel local economy, and you simply leave the corrupted progressive system behind to rot under the weight of its own incompetence. Don't argue with the system, build a new, stronger one next to it, and let the old one inevitably collapse because it lacks the competent men required to maintain it.
He gives a truly fascinating real-world example of this exit strategy in action. He details a private agricultural and trade network currently operating in rural Texas. These men have completely bypassed federal interference and massive corporate ESG compliant supply chains.
During the 2020 pandemic panic, while urban progressive areas were hyperventilating, hoarding toilet paper, and waiting for government stimulus checks, Riker notes that this Texas network operated entirely seamlessly.
They didn't miss a beat.
They relied on handshakes, mutual patriarchal respect, encrypted communications, and localized armed defense. They butchered their own livestock, traded ammunition, and maintained their own power generators. They thrived specifically because they relied exclusively on hyper-competent local masculine networks, refusing any reliance on the state.
To achieve this level of independence, Riker demands men take immediate, aggressive, and uncompromising control of two fundamental domains: their finances and their physical bodies. Financially, men must strictly control their household spending. They must brutally audit where their money goes, absolutely refusing to fund massive corporations that actively hate them, like BlackRock or Disney. You starve the beast of your capital.
And physically, the strategy is completely non-negotiable. Riker demands that every man reading his book immediately enroll in a local combat gym, specifically Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Muay Thai, or wrestling. He argues you must systematically destroy your soft, progressive conditioning through daily, intentional, exhausting physical combat.
I love how visceral he gets here. As he puts it, you must literally choke out the weak, indoctrinated, apologetic version of yourself on the mats and rebuild a harder, stoic, physically dominant man under the heavy iron of a squat rack. You have to build a body that is capable of inflicting and surviving violence so that you are never operating from a place of physical fear.
While you are building this physical and financial independence, he also introduces a tactical maneuver called the Socratic trap for dealing with those HR commissars before you are fully ready to exit the corporate world.
This is brilliant. When HR demands you adopt new pronouns in your email or orders you to attend a seminar dissecting your white privilege, you don't argue emotionally. You don't get angry. You simply deploy the Socratic method. You demand empirical data. You calmly force the HR rep to explain, on the record, the exact peer-reviewed biological basis of their gender pseudoscience. You ask them to define exactly how your competence is harming the company.
And crucially, the absolute golden rule of the Socratic trap: you never, ever apologize. You refuse the apology entirely. Riker points out that to the woke mob, an apology is never accepted as a genuine gesture of growth. An apology is viewed strictly as a written confession of guilt to be used to terminate your employment. You demand data, and you never bend the knee.
Finally, Riker frames the ultimate reclaiming of male life, specifically marrying a traditional woman and building a massive traditional family, as a profound act of rebellion. It is a patriotic and civilizational duty. In the face of a Western demographic collapse driven by historically low, below replacement birth rates, he urges men to actively seek out traditional wives who embrace their biological destiny.
He wants men to build a legacy.
He tells men to view having children not as a burden or an obstacle to personal hedonism, but as a continuation of genetic legacy, the ultimate rejection of nihilism, and the absolute bedrock of a thriving parallel community.
So when you ask if this book is a call for a massive political movement or if it is a manual for personal lifestyle secession, the answer is emphatically the latter. It is an individual, highly decentralized mandate to starve the beast. Riker wants millions of individual men to quietly, methodically withdraw their capital, their brutal physical labor, and their intellectual brilliance from the captured institutions, keeping their resources strictly within local, hyper-competent patriarchal networks.
Which leaves us with a truly profound, slightly terrifying thought to mull over, something that isn't explicitly resolved in the final pages of the text. If Riker's exit over voice strategy actually succeeds on a massive scale, if millions of highly competent men successfully build these completely parallel, insulated, heavily armed, and economically independent patriarchal economies, what happens when the captured progressive mainstream system finally runs out of the male tax dollars, the physical labor, the power grid maintenance, and the intellectual patents it relies on to survive?
It is the ultimate question regarding the destination of this cultural schism. When the heavily subsidized progressive system finally loses its invisible male subsidy, does it simply collapse quietly under the staggering weight of its own administrative incompetence? Or does it realize it is starving and try to forcefully, violently absorb those parallel networks using the heavily armed power of the state? History heavily suggests that when a parasitic system is denied its host, the reaction is rarely peaceful.
That is a fracture line we will all have to watch unfold in real time over the next decade. As a reminder, this has been an exhaustive deep dive into an incredibly provocative, uncompromising text designed specifically for men looking to understand the mechanics behind modern institutional shifts. To read the raw source material yourself, to look at the studies and the data without a filter, check Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks to buy the book, Feminist Hostages.
And for more unfiltered, ongoing analysis directly from the author regarding these cultural battles, you should highly consider following @Conrad Riker at Substack.
Finally, please don't forget to like and subscribe to our show so you never miss a deep dive into the ideas shaping our world. We started today talking about how sociology usually lacks the precision of a medical X-ray. Conrad Riker firmly believes he has provided a stark, high-contrast, undeniably clear X-ray of a captured and rotting society. Whether you aggressively agree with his diagnosis or you find it highly controversial and deeply offensive, the institutional fracture lines he highlights are undeniably fundamentally shaping the future of our culture. Until next time, keep looking deeper.